Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, both real and virtual. Welcome to the May meeting of AHSAQ. And I was thinking what I was going to talk about before we start, before I introduce, by the way, we have two speakers, one short, like me, and the other one is our main one. But thinking about it, the last 3 weeks or so, an awful lot of things have happened in the aviation world. First was a note we got very late yesterday for anybody who's interested. The RAF are going to put on another open day at Amberley on the 15th of June. And tomorrow morning, the tickets go live at 9 o'clock. So if you log into OzTix, there'll only be about 10,000. And they don't really want people like us. They want young people who can join the Air Force. If you get a ticket. So yeah, one of the other things that's been happening with aviation around Australia lately is the Noumea rescue flights. I'm a little surprised that the RAF got roped into that with Hercules. I would have thought a charter, civilian charter would have been more appropriate, but maybe they were a bit concerned about it could have been just a little bit dangerous, so they elected not. The French flew in, but I think they were French military aeroplanes as well.
And the evacuees called them French military aircraft.
Yeah.
I haven't seen any photos of that.
I saw one, it was like, but you know what VIP type flights are like. They get painted up looking like civilian aeroplanes anyway. So, and then of course we've had the PNG landslide, which is again brought the RAF into it. They've had C-130s and C-17s up there. The C-17s have been taking up the really heavy equipment. They've got to try and open the road before they can even start digging it out. And of course, the big thing, Bonza. Well, when I say big, it was no surprise to, I'm quite sure, to many of us, certainly not to me. But they did really have the rug pulled out from under them. They were not aware of what was going on. And so I feel particularly sorry for the employees, particularly the pilots or the aircrew in general, because they would have done an awful lot of training to get there. And who knows what other sorts of jobs that they passed up. And now they're stuck in limbo because Bonza hasn't been folded yet, hoping to continue. So everybody's still on standby. So still employed in inverted commas. And of course, haven't been paid. And they probably never will be.
For about 3 months. Seriously, haven't been paid for about 3 months.
Yeah. So they probably never will be. And then, of course, Air Vanuatu fell over as well.
Another non-surprise.
We had the King Air, did the wheels up at Williamtown. One of the RAF photographers was out there, and there was a very nice photograph of it just after touchdown, which I filched off the internet.
It was live on ABC. So I watched it live.
Yes, yeah. It was. I only saw this once, and of course, as usual, there were no pilots on board. Everybody was a passenger. There's so many passengers, but no pilots. It's quite amazing. One of the passengers was suffering from uncontrollable diarrhea. I only saw the reference once, but it made me laugh. Boy, was I glad I wasn't on that aeroplane. That's what fear can do to you. And then, of course, there's Boeing. The Boeing story continues on and on and on. And then, of course, we had the Spitfire. LF-16E, which looked very much like a Mark 9 to me, but it isn't. And it's an ex-D-Day aircraft. It actually flew a number of sorties on D-Day. Well, There might be a few spare parts, but it'll never fly again. I kept saying it was in a, they put it, it was in the paddock.
Mm.
Well, the paddock looked like somebody's backyard to me. So, and then of course there was the 210
Mm.
Mike Yankee Whiskey at Bankstown. Anybody not hear about that one? There were two stories. One was it was after departure and turned around and came back. And another was that it had been coming down from the Hunter.
Mm.
Does anybody know the reality?
Muscle book.
It was on the way down. Well, it makes me wonder if there might not have been just a little bit too much air in the tanks.
Mm.
Bit quiet. Okay. Yeah, but they were extremely lucky. How that wingtip did not touch that that hangar roof as he turned in on the taxiway to land, I'll never know. It must have been very, very close.
Mm.
Do you think? And then there's been Qatar had an upset problem, but Singapore takes the cake.
Mm.
And Ian knows, I've sent some emails around. The story was that the aircraft ahead of them were all diverting around something, and he didn't, and flew straight into the cell. That's, and I've seen the, what's the app that lets you see all that stuff. It's quite visible on that with a whole string of things.
Yeah.
So those are all the things that have been happening on the aviation side.
And Drummond experienced the flooding at Qatar, was it?
Dubai. Yes, that was quite something. How often does it do that? I mean, I've only been there twice transiting, and it's just all sand and stinking, and I mean really stinking hot.
Well, this is what happens when you do cloud seeding. It actually worked very well.
Worked very well.
So in holding pattern for 2 hours,
Wow.
land at a military air base, and wait for fuel to be trucked in. Yeah. So 4 days delay on my trip to Rome.
Can I just mention something else? Today, Jetstar excursion at Christchurch landed and went off the runway. Steering failure, apparently.
Hydraulic failure in the steering.
Well, it has been. I know it's a new month. We can start from scratch. That's number one now.
There is another one as well, which is a military aircraft, an F-35C, did an unplanned disassembly.
Yes.
Rather hard impact into the ground in Nevada.
Yes, it was a sloping surface, and it was just a big black burnt hot mark.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a busy month.
Still May, Bob.
Well, yes, it is still May. That's right. Today's the last day. Tomorrow we start number one. Okay. Well, as I said before, we've got two speakers. First, I'd like to introduce Roger Marks to you. Roger has a famous Queensland Airfields World War II book that he's published years and years and years ago, and in the process of which dug well into American photographic archives from the days that they were in Australia, and all that stuff went back to the US, and we don't see much of it out here. And Roger's been working on it, and he'd like to give you a quick talk about what that's all about.
Thanks, Bob. Pardon me. I usually attend these meetings by Zoom, so I'm lucky tonight. I'm in town. I want you to imagine you're at the doctor's and you're doing your plus 75 years medical annual check, and you're asked to remember a couple of phrases or whatever, and later on you're asked about them again. The first phrase I want you to remember is QAWW numeral 2. And the second phrase, from an aviation point of view, you'll all know what an F-111 is. So write down in your mind F-111, then scratch out the F and put RG in front of it. And at the end of the 11, put SC, and you'll have RG 111 SC. So remember those. I'll come back to them. Okay. 30 years ago, this year, Jenny and I published Queensland Airfields. Now, I'll pass this around for somebody who doesn't know about. Pass this around. Bob. Was anybody here, in fact, looking around, I know you weren't. Bob, Peter wasn't, although I knew Peter, he was still in Townsville, or maybe you're in Brisbane. Bob was a proofreader for Queensland Airfields then, but I think you were still in Sydney in 1994. So there's nobody left to, so I can tell tales, can't I? Although Jenny was here. So fine. Anyway, that's what happened 30 years ago. And in Queensland Airfields, what I found was the most fascinating bit was the photographs. Photographs tell all sorts of stories. And some of the best photographs came from a bloke by the name of Bob McKesh in America, at that time, late of the Smithsonian NASM scene. And he was able to give me some beauties. Page 145 or something in Queensland Airfields shows one of those of Eagle Farm. No. So when I could, and that was after we'd finished peddling the book and so on, I wanted to go to the American Archives and follow this sniff that showed the promise of lots of interesting aviation photos. Because I went looking for aviation photos, but I very fast found that what I was looking at was military history and even family history stuff. Sure, there was aviation history there too, but this military history and family history was very important. The American Archive stuff 30 odd years ago was card file index driven. Nothing of relevance really was digitised. And they told me then that they weren't going to get round to digitising this prime collection that I knew of from Bob McKesh's information, a thing called the USAF pre-1954 photo collection. So I set out to gather the photographs or copies of the photographs with a handheld digital camera. And of course, the photograph's no use unless you have the caption. So it was a case of photographing both the front and the back or the associated caption. That was great. We had lots of time needed to transcribe the captions and in effect create a database of basic, we did it with Microsoft Word tables, and that proved difficult later on. So we were always looking for a better, that we could afford, a digital asset management system. We finished up using Excel in the long run. I want you now to remember the second thing I asked you about, or to put in your mind, this RG111SC stuff, because that is the heart of the photo collection, and it's basically the record group that the National Archives, of the American National Archives, incidentally, they call themselves NARA, which is National Archives Records Administration. Our National Archives in Australia is NAA, National Archives Australia. So we had built the couple of thousand odd images that we came back with. We thought we knew by that stage that this record group 111SC was the prime fellow to chase. There are other holdings, but they're of lesser value, I believe. We had the task then of what do we do with these? It was an incomplete photo database of not good quality. The way I chose to make the general public interested in the exercise was to generate a lot of photo booklets, which typically this one is Rockhampton WW2 from an American archive, WW2 versus now, from an American archive photo viewpoint. Now, the first of these was actually a collaboration with Peter, because in 2005, the Newstead House people wanted to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Victory and Pacific thing. And Peter had been asked to put together something that would be useful as a memoir booklet or whatever. So we collaborated on that, and that became the first of the Brisbane WW2V Now series, which was finished up being 24 in number. This one here, they were produced and published 2005, 2006. In 2012, I did one on cans in the same vein. And last year, Peter assisted me with the launch of this Rockhampton one, which there are several copies there, and I'll ask Jenny to pass them around. They're surplus to the matter at the moment, so you can grab one if you'd like one. These were launched in Rockhampton's library last year, and they will be the last of these. But they all carry a common thread, and that is to wake up to the fact that there is this huge photo resource that I believed for $20 odd years was not going to get digitised. And that worried me greatly. QAWW2 is an acronym for my website, which has been running now for 30 odd years, and probably you haven't ever visited. But I ask you to remember just QAWW2. Plug that into a search engine and up will come my website, because nothing else answers to that. So when you get a chance, look at that, because more of this project to bring home these images, I'm talking about these images that American service people generated during their stay in Australia during the Second World War. Peter's own website, Oz at War, tells it all about Australia. That's my field of interest too, the Australia side of it. And here is a swag of stuff that was photographed at a time when you and I couldn't photograph sensitive areas, but they were able to, obviously. And that's why I want to get those digitised. Now, it's fine to hope that they'll get digitised. I knew the Yanks were doing some degree of digitising over the earlier part of that 20 odd years. And in fact, when you go to the website, you will read about some of that. But Peter found and relayed to me that their NARA website people now have an item called Photographs of American Military Activities. Photographs of American military activities. And it starts to show that they are actually getting around to digitising this RG111SC. So you will find, when you go to my website, you will find now that I've got both a request and a challenge. The request is that Peter, in fact, has had this interest, and he has contributed to me something like 300 odd image caption pairs, which has swollen the number that I have available. But through various ways, I've found that there are at least 5,000 images in this RG111SC that do relate to Australia. And that's the prime bit of my project, to bring home these images, because they're otherwise lying doggo in America. And when the Yanks Archive System website does get working properly, I'm told that there are lots and lots of problems, and it will take decades. So I am persevering in making sure this BHDI bit is relevant and known. So my request is, any other interested researchers, like Peter's Odds 300, tell me about what you have. They could be ones that we know. We know about the numbers of the we've got about half the 5,000 involved. We know the other half, we know the numbers of them. How? Because at some stage a few years ago, I arranged for somebody to go and photograph the card file index cards. And from those, from digitising those, I know the signal core image numbers and sometimes the caption, but certainly the categories and so on. So I know there's 5,000 odd there. We've got about half or a bit more of the 5,000. So the request is those who may have others, please tell me about it. The challenge is what Peter's found recently, this photographs of American military activities. So if you plug in Australia, you get 21 hits and only 13 of them relate to the HDI or the Australian presence. When you plug in my USB for the memory stick, sorry, for the photo database as it presently is, when you plug that in, you will find I have a request. And the request is that on that website, you will see there is the opportunity to download the full 5,000 SC numbers, half of which we know the captions and so on. The other half we don't. So from that, if you have some we don't know about, tell me. The challenge is I've sampled that 5,000 and sampled about 60 odd images and photo numbers and names. You try and plug those into NARA's website and see how you get on. And if you can find any of those 60 odd, let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. So the SC strand in that coding is signal core. US signal core. Now the main course, Ian McDonell, would you like to step forward and tell us all about aircraft, or just is it only aircraft accident? Or
Well,
you've got a lot of mining accidents you've created.
Let's see how it goes, eh?
Okay, take over, Regan.
Okay. It's funny that after a very bad month with so many reported accidents and incidents, that this should be the topic of conversation tonight. Lux a lottery, as they say. I just finished work earlier this year, January 1st, after 60 odd years in industry, including 50 years in underground coal mining. And to give some background about my interest in this, when I started, any mine that got through a year without a fatality patted themselves on the back and said, aren't we wonderful? In that time, it's changed now where a fatality in an underground mine is totally unacceptable in every sense of the word, totally unacceptable. So it has changed dramatically. I don't believe we've seen the same intensity of change in aviation. And I'm being very honest about that. And I'll talk about some of the reasons for it as we go. But so my background is and how this relates to both the topics of accident investigation and risk management is in the late 80s, we brought in mining a requirement where people supervising other people had to have very formal training in communication, in accident investigation and risk management. That's very formal courses that you actually got qualifications for. The reason for it, as it says there, was to actually give some consistency site to site, and in particular between the sites and the regulators. There are similar programs in other industries, but nowhere near to the same extent. Say that most of this started in Canada back in the late 60s, where they were having nuclear incidents that never made the papers because they were tied to national security, so nobody ever talked about them. So we introduced a whole raft of tools in investigation, into the risk management, particularly into using techniques, very intense investigation techniques, involving engineering analysis and things like that, things that were unheard of before. These things still haven't happened in aviation, by the way. And I'm not joking. The base supervisor's course for these three topics is 5 days. Yeah, you're not going to get the 5-day program tonight, just warning you. And there will not be an exam at the end. The complexity of it, the reason there's complexities in accident investigation and risk management is because everyone's got their own idea, every provider's got their own idea, and even though there are written standards, it doesn't mean that everyone teaches to those same standards. So that's a major problem. When you take it outside the mining industry and then start getting it outside industry, it keeps changing and changing. It's a bit like COVID. It keeps reproducing in a different form. So it depends a lot on what you're trying to, in investigation-wise, on what you're trying to look at. What is the type of the incident? What's the severity of the outcome? And what are regulatory requirements? So in aviation, the regulatory requirements you think are very fixed. They're not. Find me somewhere where it tells you what you actually have to investigate in an aviation incident or accident. Now, you've done a lot of these. Where was your guidelines? Yeah, that's what I thought you'd say. Right. So what we can have is in accident investigation, we can start with the most simple things where we just ask the question, what happened? Why did it happen? You get a because. And then you say, why did that happen? Because. And you can track these things down. And we have a rule. You go 5 why becauses, you should be at a root cause by then. So then you go to the next thing. And you develop that off a timeline. So you start off, here is the end result, and you go back as far as you can in time to where something could have contributed. And you drop down off each of those a why because. It's very simple, but very, very effective. And it develops into every organisation likes to do it differently, of course, because that wouldn't be funny if you didn't. So a why before, of course, this is called an Ishikawa diagram. Ishikawa is a Japanese bloke who drew a fishbone and said, I can use that to do accident investigations. And very effective, actually. But the why because is a development of that. Someone said, that's too complex. That's too complex. You're getting where I'm going? Righto. More complex, we go to root cause. As I said, where you, why because and then root cause. So you're looking for those root causes, the things where you make a change that will affect the outcome, hopefully positively. With risk assessment, it's all about the same complexities because you have to have some perception of the potential for a probability of an event happening and the consequence of that. We'll go into this in a little bit later and you'll see the complexities. Those who have done all this before, I do apologise. I know this is old hat, but for some people, hopefully it's new information. In risk assessments, we can start off with the most simple things like a slam or a take 5. Now, when I say simple, this is where if I tread in that puddle, will my boot get wet? Okay, what do? Don't tread in it. So, of course, our bright mining companies with all these wonderful degree people now produce a book like this where every person's got to fill in one of these every single task that they do. Now, where a miner underground on a long walk can be doing 100 tasks in a day, you're starting to see the ideas of how really effective that is. So you can have these simple stuff and go right through to what's called an enterprise broad brush risk assessment. So for an airfield like Archerfield, that will have 25 or 30,000 lines in it, each of which must be assessed separately. That normally takes forever and 14 days. If I'm doing it, it's a flat fee of $50,000. Simple as that, because it's going to take that long to do. There's a direct relationship between accident, investigation, and risk assessment. They are actually mirror images. In the middle here, we've got a thing called the hazardous event. You can come at it from 2 directions. You can come at it from the potential causes, and you can come at it from potential outcomes, right? The idea is that you have to identify, that side you identify causes and you put preventative barriers in to stop it. This side, you identify consequences and have barriers that defend those, that mitigate the consequences, reduce them. Now, you can do that in either way. That can be a risk assessment or it can be an accident investigation. The way you do it just is a different piece of paper. You remember all this from what you did? Yeah. Flash of it. Okay. Right. So accident investigation talks about what happened, why did it happen, how do we prevent a recurrence. Risk assessment says what could happen, why would it happen, and how can we prevent it. When you go to a coronial inquest, which is one of the most fun things you'll ever do in your life, the coroner has those three things. That is all he's interested in. The rest of it is just padding, and as you know, those have been there, it gets padded out to buggery, but all he really wants to know is what happened, why did it happen, how are we going to make sure it doesn't happen again? Simple as that. What I want to do is look at an actual accident that I want you to have a think about. Has anybody actually done serious accident investigations? Okay. Well, very briefly.
Predominantly, we look back at the Formica process.
Yep.
And you got the mic. Take it back to the local effect.
Yep.
Next highest level and the end effect.
Yep. Yep.
And then we look at the other points that you're bringing up in that process and document the probability of the occurrence in the first instance. And quite often we can find it down to material, the wrong screws, such as on aircraft windscreens.
Yep.
And then you get it back to what you're talking about is the management process. Why did it happen? Why were the wrong screws fitted?
That's it.
How to remedy it, make sure it doesn't occur again.
And that gets down to that why, because, the simplistic form of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
What we'll go on to on the next slide, if you would, is exactly what you're talking about now, what's involved and why does it get complex? If it's a contained accident like on the road where one car runs into another car and nothing moves after that, you've retained a site and the police get there very, very quickly. Aviation accidents don't normally happen like that. The severe ones tend to involve things that are nowhere near anything that can get there quickly, spread out over huge areas. I think of the shooting down an airliner near the Ukraine. It'd be a classic example where you've got things spread all over the place. You don't know actually what even happened. And it takes days, weeks, months before you get a good picture of things. That is not atypical in aviation major accidents. And so there's a lot of critical things, as again, you'll remember, about control and preservation of the site and evidence. And if there are live victims, the state of the persons involved, not just the participants, but the state of the witnesses is extremely critical. You hear all the time now about making counselling available. There's good reasons for it. It's about the mental health, but it's also about retaining the mental, to make sure you've got things that matter. Participation of police regulators, and particularly who has prime responsibility. We have the fight all the time between the police and everyone else about who owns an accident site. Every single accident you'll ever go to will have the accident, will have this argument. And the police like to think they own it all, and they become rather belligerent at times. The whole point is, the reason we have to get that control in early is to establish that basic timeline, because everything hangs off the timeline. Without that, you're not going anywhere. And everything you write down or get or gather has to be verified, not just once, but many, many times. And that gets on the next one, separation of witnesses. The police in particular teach big time about the bank robbery syndrome. If you have 3 robbers walk into a bank and there's 30 people in the bank, right? If you keep all those people together, you will get 3 descriptions which are identical and none of them will look anything like the security camera. If you separate them, you'll get 90 different pictures and 3 of them will be correct. And that's why we have so many security cameras, because witnesses are very unreliable. 2 things happen. You've got a thing called implanted memory and a thing called acquired memory. Implanted memory, the bully in a group, I will bully you until you agree that that bloke was black, when in fact he was yellow, right? That's an implanted. The other is acquired, where if those 3 people are talking, I'll say, oh, geez, I thought he was black. Oh, they're saying he's yellow. Okay, he must have been yellow. Unreliability of witnesses, really, really bad. Now, when we have an aviation, I'm sure you've all seen how accurately the press report things from witnesses. Yeah, you got it. Okay, so the critical thing is about fact finding here. The thing that police tend to do, not as badly as they used to, but originally all they were looking for is to someone to give a ticket to. Nowadays, they generally wait 3 days, but the same result. In real accident investigation, it's about finding the facts so we can prevent it recurring, not about finding fault. The finding fault comes much later on, once we've got a report that we can guarantee has some veracity. Okay, an actual event. Doesn't matter what day it is, but at 10:40 in the morning, a Cessna it's 206 took off, and this was in Queensland, and crashed into a dam. All 7 people on board died. Now think about if you are right there in there, and you can be police, you can be first responder, I don't care what you think you are, but you're part of that initial emergency response investigation team. When you get there, that's how you find the wreckage. Yet you were told it crashed into a dam. So what's the first sort of question you're going to ask? How did it get bloody out of the dam? And in reality, this is what the first people who got there. So what did they do? Because there's 6 people in there, or 7 actually. So they organised to drag the thing out as quick as possible, just in case anyone's still alive. Well motivated. What's the problem with doing that? Loss of evidence, big time. So there's this strip, there's the airstrip. You see from where it took off down the building end down there to the dam is only a very short distance. Okay, again, we have all these primary requirements, legislation, judicial, coronial, insurance. So we need to find out what happened. What happened? The plane crashed in the dam. Okay, but we really need to find why that happened. What happened is really easy. The people saw it crash. Right? Why did it happen? And this is where it gets very difficult once you've tampered with evidence. And the recurrence, all right. What I'll put in here is the last thing, preventing recurrence brings in risk management. If you're going to change something, you are obligated by law to risk manage that change. Because frequently we make changes that create a whole new raft of risk that generally have bad outcomes because we didn't think about it. So when we decided to change markings on the road to a different type of marking, nobody actually tested that it wasn't slippery in the wet. And it got changed very quickly within weeks because we're having a lot of accidents with people's brakes locking up on these brand new markings. Especially motorbikes, yes. Okay, so unintended consequences. So let's go back to the next slide. I'll just go to the next slide, not back to it. Okay. So we said the key things. We maintain the scene for investigator. In this case, it's impossible, isn't it? You've got the thing dragged out there. The bodies are all already, they're starting to pack them away. Yeah? So you've lost so much of your evidence. So how are you going to gain back? And what you say is we start talking to the people who actually were there first, the people who are involved in it. It was a skydiving operation. So you've got the loaders, you've got the people, you've got everyone on the ground involved in it. You've got the maintainers, if there's mechanics still there that work on the plane, all those things. But also anybody who's watching, they normally have heaps of spectators at these things. And again, we're back to that idea of people crossing information and getting the wrong story. We're here hours later, it's going to happen. So when I said there before, where everything you get, you've got to check, double check and keep going until you can guarantee reasonably. Maintaining the memory, recording the information. How do you actually do it? I find a digital camera and a digital recorder, and the first 2 things you must have. You haven't got time to write things down anymore because there's too much to do. So you have the camera and a video, whichever one you want to use, and a digital sound recorder going, and you just keep going. You'll get 1,000 hours. That's going to take you months to go through, but it doesn't matter. You've got it all there. The timeline we mentioned, critical. You've got to test it as raw information. When you get it, it's raw. It's got to be proven data. So it's got to go through, and you actually do a box, and I'm sure you've worked on this, where you have a piece of information and you say, what is my veracity check on this? And once you've got about 3 things that all say the same, you normally can give it a tick in the green box. Now, here's where we get to, and today was another classic example of this, Mr. Trump, right? The idea of statutory law and common law. Right? Statutory law is if you go over more than 60 k's up that road there, you're going to get a ticket. Common law, and what we talk about that is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Common law is about proof that is at best near a balance, you know, a strong possibility or probable or maybe. Now, we've seen this happen recently in Australia a couple of times. The Donald Trump case is a classic case of statute law being ruled under common law. There was not one credible scrap of evidence presented to that court that could convict anybody. 34 convictions. You've seen the rape case in Canberra, not a scrap of credible evidence. But on the balances of probability, he must have done. Right? It goes on and on. Now, the problem with this is, in all these accidents, people start thinking in common law terms, oh, well, I think that might happen. When it goes to the coroner, he's not interested really. If you want to think something happens, show me your evidence. And the police keep tripping up on this over and over and over again in the coronial court because, oh, he said, she said. No, that's not evidence. Go away. Come back with some real stuff. So when I go on and rave on about evidence, I'm serious about it. The things that can go wrong. All those cases that are happening are all going to be thrown out in appeals court. Of course, the appeals court is purely statutory. There is no balance of probabilities in an appeal court. It's got to be hardcore evidence.
On the previous slide,
Yeah, please.
one of the first things to do would be isolate the aircraft.
Oh, definitely.
Quarantine it.
Yeah. Sorry, that should be on there. You're right.
Yeah,
yes.
before anything else.
Yep.
And we've found that some of the best witnesses are small children because they will tell you what they saw.
Yep.
Whereas an adult will already have done an appreciation on what they think they saw.
Yep.
So
Yep.
quite often a child up to 6 or 7 will give you a more valid response.
And it's amazing how the youngest of children can produce the most amazing drawings of accidents.
Yep.
Because exactly what you said, they've got a fresh mind that's taken it in like a rat trap. And all they do is put what's in their mind out there. There's no confusion. Of course, the older you get, the more likely it is to be your own upbringing, your influences, your education, all these things change your mental opinion. And especially if it's a person you hate that's in that car accident, you're going to make sure that you tell the police that he was the bastard who caused it. There's no doubt about it. His name was Trump, exactly. All right. Now I need my mate here. That's your job. Put on your glasses. The Cessna 206 accident. Let's go forward many, many weeks and find out what we know so far. The 206 itself was actually a very, very old aircraft, a 1960s build, 1965 in fact. Went to New Zealand, straight from America, New Zealand, and was used over there for 34 years in tourism and skydiving. Then came in Australia in 02 to be used as a parachute plane based in Queensland. Now, if you don't know a 206, it's nominal, 1 pilot, 5 passengers. It's got a 285 horsepower motor, gross weight 1473, empty weight 786, payload of 607 kilos, of which 177 kilos is a full tank of fuel, big fuel tanks. For skydiving, they take out all the seats except the pilot's seat. That saves them about 40 kilos. So that increases the payload to 647, which we take out 177 kilos for fuel. Now work out 7 people in what's left. Okay, plus parachutes. Okay, all right. There's a couple of different reports. Brisbane Skydiving Centre did their own accident investigation. My friend over here, Bob, has got the official investigation report. And we might just have a little quick challenge about the differences. What the Brisbane Skydiving sent everything over to England to an aircraft accident investigation centre at one of the universities to get fresh ideas, because they were a little bit, well, I'll be polite and say Brisbane Skydiving were a bit confused about what they were hearing. A wide range of safety discrepancies and oversights, a number of which likely contributed to the crash. Now it says here, here's the difference, that killed 5 of the 7 people on board. I'm pretty sure the accident report said a little bit different to that, but let's not harp on that. Among the concern included smoke seen billowing from the 206 as it took the runway for takeoff. Now, where did that come from? It's funny you should have mentioned that. An 11-year-old boy. And everyone said, oh, what was that? We thought that's what they did all the time. Pilot, substandard fuel in the fuel tanks. And guess what? Guess what caused the black smoke? Water in the fuel tanks. So all you pilots here, what do we normally do with fuel? Yeah, anyway, yeah, you know the answer. A pilot who lacked the proper certification to conduct commercial side isling flights. In fact, he didn't have a lot of hours. Passenger restraints loosely fastened to the plane's floor. Yeah, well, they might have been loosely fastened, but in reality, the only person wearing a restraint was the pilot, because the rest of them sit on the bloody floor so they can jump out. And an aircraft loaded 200 pounds or 100 kilos over its, gee, we worked that one out already, didn't we? The bottom line of all this expensive sending it over there was that clearly there is not one particular thing that caused the crash. So crook fuel and overloading is two things. So, okay, you've got to agree with that. Bob, what does the official version say?
It comes to the end here and it says ongoing investigation issues.
No, isn't that funny? So here is much the same sort of thing in much the same rambling style, and it doesn't actually come to a conclusion. And it says we're going to continue. Now, given the date that this happened quite a few years ago now, there's never been a follow-up report to that.
It's 18 years old.
Seriously, never a follow-up report.
An operator over.
Oh, very definitely. But how many, just off the top of your head, how many different people were responsible for that?
So you go back to the refuel at the start.
So where did the fuel actually came from 44-gallon drums hand pumped into the fuel tanks. Now, all of you who fly know that nobody in their right mind uses fuel out of a drum anymore, right? And hopefully never see it again. Okay, so then the next one, of course, so there's your refueler. Who's your next one after the refuelers?
Pilot.
Oh, himself.
Loadmaster is another one, yep. Would it have been obvious to blind Freddie that the plane was overloaded? If you had read the manual, it would have been.
Ultimately, it comes down to the pilot.
But PIC cops it every time because it's his job. He actually appears that he didn't have any commercial qualifications at all. He was studying for them. I'm not sure, I think it was 187 hours or something like that, you know, really high time qualified to be kicking people out of a plane. But the whole point of it is, all this information is available by digging deep enough and going through that. The timeline in this case is very simple. Stick 7 people in a plane, hit the power button, it falls off the end and dives into a dam and everyone drowns. You know, real simple timeline, a couple of minutes long, but it isn't, because you've got to go back in the timeline to the start of it all. The start of it all probably was its last maintenance check. When was the last time the fuel tanks were taken out and checked like they're supposed to be? Yeah, all that comes into it. I don't see any of that in any of these reports. Right? Now, this was all supervised by ATSB, and that's whose heading's on the top there. Right? And you see how dedicated they were to 7 dead bodies. They didn't even bother doing a final report. I was critical of them at the start. That is the kind of thing I'm critical about. We better go on.
Enough fuel to get him to the dam.
Well, what it wasn't, the fuel's dirty, it's blowing smoke, it's not producing full power. And the witnesses actually, sorry?
He hit a tree.
Yeah, it was a tree on climb that he should have climbed over very easily. Clipped that straight in the dam. Yep. Okay, let's develop that into a risk assessment. 206s are a fabulous plane. I've seen them flying out in New Guinea with 14 people in them.
Yeah, but then once you start with like 7 people bought tickets, and you know, did people go that far?
Did any of those people get weighed?
No.
No, this mob. You find me a skydiving organisation actually weighs the people. By the way, there hasn't been a single prosecution out of this, not a single one. That one has been tested in court in many, many occasions where people say, I'm not really a commercial pilot because I'm just working for my hours, right? It doesn't hold water, does it? Not even close. So how far do you go back with the fuel? That's the why, because you go back until you've got a very positive outcome that you can say that is the root cause. And that would include how long's the fuel been in there, what grade was it, where did it come from, blah, blah, blah. How were the drums sitting? Were they on their side like they're supposed to be, or because I'm lazy, I'll leave it up like that so I can throw a pump in it easy? Yeah, all those things come into it. You may get answers, you may not. There is nothing, any of those reports to indicate the quarantining of evidence would be, I think the best description may be shoddy. When I said about the sloppiness in aviation, I excluded the military in that because they're not even part of the real world when it comes to this. They are superior. They're not up to mining, of course, but they're superior.
If they talk about the fuel in here, both of the operators' aircraft were fueled on the previous night by the owner from drum fuel stock. The fuel on board the aircraft was contaminated by water from the dam, not able to be tested. A sample was taken from the fuel drum used to fuel the aircraft and tested at the testing authority. They found that there were high amounts of visible solid matter, an excessive boiling point, distillation value of the fuel, and high levels of existent gum. Insufficient fuel remained in the operator's drum stock to allow further testing.
And again, the other report talks about a drum having significant amount of water in the residue, but they couldn't verify that that was before it was pumped or after. In risk assessments, they are now controlled by an international standard. The Australian standard was complex and had 10,000 words for each actual word it needed. Fortunately, the international standard now has revised that, so there's 100,000 words for each word now. I'm serious. They are just ridiculous. So the important part of risk assessment was what I said before about the perceived or measured probability and consequence. For any incident, there is a probability that may happen and a consequence if it does. The trouble is, and we'll talk about, is that has a lot of variability into it. So more severe the potential outcome, or the more probability an outcome raises its risk potential, or a risk ranking as it's commonly called. The standards actually give some guideline risk matrices that some people use. Most companies now invent their own to suit their own purpose. They aren't necessarily in line with the standard. Sometimes they're bent a lot to suit a corporation's needs. Is it legal? Of course not. But they do give some guidance. Standards do give some guidance on acceptable risk mitigation. How do you control this perceived level of risk? What do you need to do to control it that would be acceptable? And we get to some really interesting, well, I find it interesting, but I've done postgraduate legal. So of course it's interesting. For everything else in the world, it's boring as batshit. Okay, 3 types of risk assessments: quantitative, semi-quantitative, and qualitative. Quantitative means it's based on numbers, like an insurance company. Semi means it's a mixture of numbers and descriptions. Qualitative, which most of what we do now is, it's all about description. Bang. Righto. Here is a qualitative, pure descriptive risk matrix. And we look at this and we talk about the likelihood of a consequence, and we'll talk about the maximum reasonable consequence. So see, likelihood starts at almost certain, likely, occasionally, unlikely, rare. Come across, the consequence goes from insignificant, minor, moderate, major, and catastrophic. Now, for each organisation or each case or each risk assessment tool you're using will have descriptors around there. So what is absolutely certain means if you do it right now, it's going to happen. Right? If it's catastrophic, it means when you do it and it's going to happen, you're dead. And then it goes all the way back down to low, which means it's probably never going to happen. And even if it does, you won't even notice it. That's about the range. You see the colour coding? Very important, because the colours talk about if you go off that, that is your assessed level of risk from low, moderate, high to extreme. And this is what it's about. There's a hierarchy controlled for those assessed risks, right? We talk about a control level against the colour. If we have a green, which means very unlikely to happen, and even if it didn't, there'd be no real outcome anyway. We talk about a green being a PPE level. That's oversimplified, PPE, personal protective equipment, right? That's very oversimplified. That can be anything from nothing at all to some very basic controls, because PPE is the most single misunderstood control. If you're a butcher and you wear a chainmail glove, what level of control is that? It's not PPE. That's an engineered control. Because you get a knife and bash it, there is no way you can ever cut your hand. Right? So that isn't PPE. That's the confusing part. PPE could be safety boots, but only the steel toe cap part of them is PPE, the rest of them are worthless. Okay, let's go back to the top right. If we go up to red, that is your critical catastrophic. It says that you must eliminate whatever creates that situation. So if it's two cars colliding in an intersection, right, you have to eliminate that from happening. Now remember, risk management cannot risk manage human stupidity. Only a shotgun can do that. So if you've got a red level, you must eliminate the hazard and the risk associated. It's got to be taken out of play. At Caboolture, where I unfortunately got a job of doing the risk management up there, we had a multiple fatality with 2 aircraft mid-air collision. A Piper Pawnee tug was coming in on one strip and a light aircraft on the other one, and they managed to meet in the middle and 2 people died. That is a red level. How do you eliminate that practically? Suggestions. How can you eliminate? So, sorry? That's exactly what the council did. They told us we can't have the second runway because we can't manage it. The fact that the aircraft were all operating against the procedures of it didn't come into it. That's the human behaviour part, right? What the council said, because they actually own the airfield, they said, you've got to go to eliminate, so we'll do it for you. 0624 shut. Finished. That's it. Substitution means you find another way of doing it, another process, another piece of equipment, any other way of doing it. So in some ways, if you've got a level crossing, you can substitute a passover, right? It gets arguable which way it is. Remember, take out the human behaviour out of it. Right? When you're doing these, forget about people complying with it, because that's that level. Administration relies on human behaviour, the same as pure protective stuff relies on people doing it. James Reason, the English bloke who started this all going before Canada got involved, put up a table that says, here, how you manage human behaviour. And it starts off from the usual things about teaching people better and all that sort of stuff, right through the ideas. When it gets to that level, you pull out a gun and shoot them. And the best example is when you go out on the freeway tonight or whenever you go, if you do 109 kilometres an hour in 100 zone, you'll get a low-level ticket and a slap on the hand, right? And that's about it, and probably a finger wag from the cop. If you do 190, you're going straight to jail. That's the difference in how you manage it. It depends on the actual level of risk. I probably should have gone back to the other one. When you do that table, right? Remember, it was about probability and consequence and the different levels of consequence. And it depends on the exact situation what those mean. And you have to define in a risk assessment, you have to define what you mean. If you work for a big corporation, they will give you definitions, right down to how many nuts and bolts you lost or it would cost you $3 to fix it or something like that. They go to silly lengths for something that's really simple. Okay. When we go into this, and this is where it gets difficult, because you've got to do your controls to answer British law that goes back to the 1700s. I'm serious. When they started the Industrial Revolution, when they were killing people by the zillions, the courts got involved and said that a person managing the process had to do what a reasonable, practical, prudent person would do. And they use those terms. Those terms are still written in law now. Reasonable, practical, prudent, right? And we have the concept written in all our laws that says that you will manage risk to a level that is as low as reasonable, practical, or achievable. There are two different things. Our lawyers tend to think they're the same, but under the British definitions, they're entirely different. Practical means it can be done no matter what the cost. Achievable means it has to have limits on it. Does that make sense? Okay. And that brings in the concept of what is a reasonable amount of money to have to spend on those risk controls. If you've got a $10 problem, you aren't expected to spend $1 million. If you've got $1 million problem, it's not acceptable to spend 10. And the courts ruled very clearly on that all the time. Then the next thing happens, you've worked out all these magic controls and all that, you put them in, and then you've got to show that they're effectively implemented. So you've got to control, how did you actually implement it? This is where everything falls over in court. We have these buckets of people working for BAT, hundreds and hundreds of people doing this risk management, and they produce all these control plans. They get put in an action plan that gets put in a computer, and they're never, ever seen again. And when they did an audit on said company some time ago, they had hundreds of thousands of actions from risk management projects that had never been acted on. Imagine what a good bloody lawyer could make of that one. Then once you've implemented, then you've got to prove that they actually worked. So effective implementation means you've actually implemented it, then you've got to prove that it's actually continuing to work. It's not as easy as it sounds. So when the airfield does that 15,000 line broad brush risk assessment, guess how many controls come out of that? How do you think that can ever be done? You did it in the Air Force. It's all right if you've got someone with charcoal over their shoulder waving a finger at you, you've got a chance of getting something done, but out in the real world, it doesn't work. All right, let's get some practical stuff. If you've got an aircraft accident that kills 287 people, right, you can't say that's anything less than maximum catastrophic, right? So how can these airlines be allowed to fly if that's the potential? Every time you get in a commercial airline, 287 people can die. How are they allowed to fly? The problem with probability, and every argument you'll ever get into in a risk assessment, is about those probability and consequences. People say, oh, but it's a fatality, it's got to be up there. No, the law doesn't say that, the standards don't. They talk about the most reasonable practical outcome, right? And the reasonable practical probability, those two things. So what's the true exposure for airliners?
A good example, the human factors that when the 110 Land Rover came into vet service, the Parenti, it replaced the Series 3 Land Rover. We found that most of the run off the road rollover accidents occurred with the older drivers, not the younger drivers who were trained on the 110.
Yeah.
And the reason was on a dirt road, and it only occurred on dirt roads, is the Series 3 Land Rover, you could plough it around a corner. The front wheels would push the dirt up and help you around the corner.
Oh, yeah.
But the 110, being constant four-wheel drive, would ride up over that and exit the road.
Oh.
So the young people who were trained on the Parenti to start with, they were able to operate the vehicle within there and the vehicle's envelope, whereas the older drivers had to be retrained. So that was an administrative change.
Yeah, true.
Make them aware they couldn't plough it around a corner.
Yep. That is actually what, well, it's somewhere between administrative and one level above that, because there's some engineering in it that's causing it, but there's some engineering that gets you out of it at the same time. And I suppose you could even say there's a little bit of substitution in there as well. And this is where it gets difficult, because people try to tie a label on something when there's more a sphere involved.
That's right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, right. Okay, so what I said there is you've got those severities ranging from, this is now a commercial aircraft flight, right? From multiple fatality through to absolutely no loss at all. Even a near miss is considered as a no loss, right? And if you distill into 5, you've got from extremely unlikely down to almost certain, and those go equal. So multiple fatality is extremely unlikely, right? Single fatality. Now, the thing is about when you go in that commercial aircraft tomorrow, what is the most reasonable, practical level of severity and likelihood based on those lines? So you jump in Qantas tomorrow morning, going out to, probably don't go Singapore, go somewhere where there's no turbulence. Let's go that way. Okay, really? Okay. And to get there, we talk about statistically impossible. Insurance underwriters understand statistically impossible, right? It's 99.95%. If the risk is lower than 0.05%, then it's considered statistically impossible and therefore insurable. And that's why aircraft can fly. It's not about the deaths and all that, it's about insurability. And that's the magic figure, right? In the world of commercial aviation, at any time, there will be 99.95% around the world, right? 0.05% of a fatality accident in a commercial airline is 0.05 or less. In fact, it's about 0.01. What do I do is to get that, because this is now an official figure, that is a quiet time on the world front. That's a snapshot at 1 second in a 24-hour period around the world of all the aircraft in the world. If you blow those things up, that's not much, because when you blow it up, there's all the bits that are overlying. In every single day in the USA, there is between 130,000 and 200,000 commercial flights in the USA. How many fatality crashes are there in the US in commercial aviation every day? None. When was the last one you heard of in the USA? Doesn't happen very often, does it? In fact, around the world, it doesn't happen, but it makes sensational headlines. So the reality is that less than 0.05% is the magic number, and that's why we can fly in a commercial airline. And that's what we're trying to manage everything to. We want to get that down where realistically and honestly, we've got a risk thing that says that it's practically impossible for a bad outcome. And if you look at it, we get in a plane, we fly there, nothing happens. That's exactly what we want. Line 5 on that other chart, line 5. No outcome, highly likely. And that's risk assessment.
You're more likely to have an accident on the way to the airport to catch the flight than you are in the flight.
Well, why are we allowed to drive on the road if it's so dangerous? Because the same statistics are there. How many movements of a vehicle from point A to point B do you think happen in Queensland every day? This is 10 years old, it's 3.3 million, yeah. And now it's changed a bit through, I would say it's probably more likely to be double that now. Easily. Yeah. Okay, so commercial airline, we went through that. Remember, it's about the most reasonable outcome based. If it's insurable, then it's got to have been that.
Well, speaking of rail and coal, the accident that happened up north, where the driver had 2 engines. He was in the front, and there was a central engine. And as he went over the crest, and I'm sure you're aware of this one, he told the central engine to throttle back, and it didn't. It just kept on full power, and he rode the train and survived. That was amazing. And being self-insured, Queensland Rail dealt with it. But the point is, if you'd looked at that from a design point of view, there was no handshaking, that the central engine should have said, am I under control? Am I under control? No, I'm not. I shut down.
Yep.
And that was the outcome of that, but that was post the incident. That should have been in the design phase of your Formica and your HAZOP.
And that's probably one of the big things that's changed over time, is the amount of risk management that goes in the very fundamental first phase of the overall concept, where they start the risk management process there. And there's so many projects get dumped at that stage before they even spend $1 building something, because they say, no, we're not. And the test is, will it be insurable? Seriously, that's the big test. Will it be insurable? If it's not, chuck it away.
So in the Boeing situation recently with this, in the Boeing situation recently with the 737s, imagine you've got lots of different airlines and they've all got their own risk assessments. But the problem is the plane. How do you deal with that? Like, how do you, as a company, like, Air Canada's had their thing. Is it the plane? Is it something they did?
Well, it depends on which particular incident. If you go to the most recent publicised one about a door falling off, Boeing some years ago decided to, because American labour was starting to get expensive at $16 an hour, that they needed to second some of this stuff overseas where the labour rates were about $3 an hour. So they built subsections of the plane in other countries where it's like, remember, they build it there and then ship it back to America. So you get an idea about how cheap the labour must be. Anyway, what happens is then you have different standards. Now, Boeing used to have very good standards inspection, but again, inspectors started to have to be getting too much money, $90 an hour. And they said, we can't afford all these inspectors. We'll get them inspected overseas before they come back. Now, how do you risk manage that? You pay the money, but Boeing can't because they're broke. So what's their solution? They're going to buy the company overseas that builds these things so they can put their own inspectors over there. Will that work? Not yet. Yeah, look, they're in deep trouble. But the other problems, this thing with the overriding the dual sensors overriding the control, that actually goes back to an Airbus accident, an Air France Airbus accident coming out of South America many, many years ago, when the pitot head froze, and because it couldn't get a reading, the automatic system overrode the pilots and they couldn't shut it off. Right? So it wasn't that Boeing didn't know about it. They kept saying, we never predicted this and all that. It was there in writing. How do you risk manage that? Sorry. Oh, sorry, Roger.
You mentioned that some mine operation in Goonyella gave you lots and lots of trouble.
Yeah.
Was it open cut or
No, underground.
Underground?
Oh, yeah,
And
underground.
what were the basic problems, the main problems?
All right. The biggest single problem is explosive gas, methane. Methane, it's a thing called adsorption. You've never heard of the word before, but methane lives in coal, not in any physical form that it's not a gas, it's not a liquid, and it's not a solid. It's adsorbed into it, and nobody can actually explain how you can get 50 or 60 cubic meters of methane into a cubic meter of coal. That's reasonably tight. But it is. And as you open it and break it, the gas comes out. And if it comes out quick enough, it will outburst and bury people. Or lumps will hit them and kill them. Or the gas will explode and blow the mine up. Or worse still, it'll lie around in little pieces and then self-heat itself, spontaneous combustion, and you get the same effect. The mine burns down. That's just one. The other one is the mine goes deep very quickly. So you get intense strata pressure. Then Mother Nature decided this should be a tectonic formation area where the land moved constantly and still does. So it's full of these fractures and slips and faults and of every type you can imagine, which builds up more stress. And every time you try and cut through it with a machine, it falls on your head.
This is not necessarily a question. It's more a statement going back to your comment with regard to coroners and coroners courts. I was running a training program once for train controllers, and we had a guest speaker there, and the guest speaker was making a comment, and he was trying to reinforce decision making, and especially when it came to hazards, etc.
Yep.
And he said his question when he was talking to the managers was, my question for you is, does it pass the coroner's test?
Yep.
That is,
Yep.
where would you prefer to be justifying your decision, in a coroner's court or a management meeting?
Yeah.
His comment was, believe me, you would prefer to be doing it at a management meeting rather than a coroner's court. So the coroner's test was something that obviously embedded in my mind.
I had a mining warden, which is the mining coroner, who somebody quoted that one day at a hearing. And he said, you know, there's a big difference, don't you? And this smart-ass witness said, no, what's that? And he said, well, in a coroner's court, in a warden's court, the people here know what they're talking about. You've proven that your management team doesn't.
Okay. Any online questions? Nothing online? Okay, everybody. Well, we'll pack it in for the May meeting. See you all in another month if you can make it. I hope you enjoyed this because I found it very interesting.
Oh, thank you. We'll come back next Monday and start the holiday course.